agenda we want to cover. First of all, we're going to talk somewhat about the position and the history of Jericho, where it stood in the history and physically where it stood. And then we'll talk about the way it was destroyed, the way it was encircled in the way we've just read there in that 6th chapter of Joshua. Note how that Jericho was devoted, the word cursed there in the AV, is really devoted to Yahweh, to the Lord. And then we'll look at the cause of the fall and some issues about rebuilding Jericho, and then we'll look right at the end at sort of the typical significance of the fall of Jericho. Okay, so first of all, location and the position of Jericho. Well, we see here this was where the children of Israel started, on the eastern side of Jordan at Shittim. They crossed, as we mentioned, miraculously, covered in some detail with those stones that are left in the middle of the Jordan. They went to Gilgal at first, but now we've arrived at Jericho. Now Jericho's just to the west of the river. There's another more sort of pictorial sort of map. Interesting that the New Testament Jericho and the Old Testament Jericho seem to be in a slightly different position, maybe because Jericho was pretty well destroyed. The other interesting thing to notice about Jericho is its altitude. It is actually below sea level. It's about 800 feet below the sea level. So there's the level of the Dead Sea, or the Mediterranean Sea. So it's not the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is also below, of course. The Mediterranean Sea. So Jericho is a very low-lying city. So that's where it is and was. Now we're going to have a look at a little bit of the history of Jericho, which is very interesting, and it has a certain rugby connection, this, because there are two people, father and son, John Garstang and his son. I don't know what his first name was, but he was a senior master at rugby school, so quite local, and they were both involved in the early parts of the 20th century in exploring the remains of Jericho, and they discovered by their excavations that there were in fact there'd been 4 cities of Jericho. There was a very early one there, a Stone Age one, which we can see here, and then a second version, also very ancient, and then this third city, which is a bit more of interest to us, was established by the Hyksos shepherds. We'll say a little bit more about them in a minute. These Hyksos shepherds were very prominent in Egypt at the time when the children of Israel were there. And then we get to the 4th city, which is the city which Joshua destroyed, and that's the date, estimated date that the 4th city applied. It was slightly smaller than the 3rd city, as we see, and we'll talk about it in a minute. So those are the 4 cities, and these were discovered by John and Garstang and his son. I said we'd say a little bit about these Hyksos shepherds. They were actually they came from Syria, and they were, as the name implies, they were shepherds, and they actually conquered Egypt. And so at the time when Joseph and his family, 70 souls who moved from Israel into Egypt, at the time they were there, Egypt was actually ruled by these foreigners, these Hyksos shepherds. Remember when Joseph's family moved into the land, he says, every shepherd is an abomination in the sight of the Egyptian. Well, why was it? It was because they'd been invaded by shepherd kings. So the Egyptians themselves were not shepherds, but the Hyksos rulers at that time were, and we can understand how sympathetic they were to Joseph and his family. However, as we know, to use the scriptural phrase, a new king emerged which knew not Joseph. Now that was because the Hyksos were defeated finally, and the original Egyptian rulership was restored. It's called the Theban line. It's based on the city of Thebes, which is just to the east of the River Nile. So we've now gone back to the previous and more ancient rulers of Egypt, a lot less sympathetic, of course, to the children of Israel, as we know. And in BC 1600, which was right at the end, see, of the Hyksos shepherd period, they burned Jericho. This is Jericho 3. We call it Jericho 3 because remember those 4 Jerichos. The Hyksos was the Jericho 3, quite a large city. 1600 BC, when the Thebes got going, they burned the city. However, 25 years later, BC 1575, it was partially restored by the Egyptians. And now, remember, at this time, the Egyptians actually conquered quite a lot of land to their east, right up what was then Canaan, Palestine or Israel, and further north than that. So the Egyptians were in control at that time, and so they had control of Jericho. Now they also, although they shrunk the thing, I'll show you a picture of it in a minute. Although they shrunk the city, they did build another wall around an inner wall, with the idea of improving the defences. However, the Garstang team found that these foundations of this second wall were rather shaky, weren't very good foundations. The inner walls were actually stronger than the outer wall. And also they tended to build houses against that outer wall. And maybe Rahab's house was one of those. But it wasn't a good idea to build domestic property against a defensive wall. There's that comment. There's this artist's impression of the fourth city. Prominent palm tree here. Jericho is also known as the city of palm trees. It was called that in Chronicles. But we can see here, this is the new outer wall here, and here is the remains of the old Hyksos outer wall, which was actually quite substantial. So this was the outer wall that the children of Israel walked round with the priests and the trumpets and so on. You can see how much higher the land to the west of Jericho is. Jericho being such a low-lying city. Okay, that's just obviously an artist's impression because the city was subsequently destroyed, and this outer wall here, of course, was the one that fell down, fell flat, to use the term that we just read from Joshua 6. Just a few words before we get into the actual destruction of the city. A few words about the prominent pharaohs at this time. BC 1475, that was the time, if you remember, did I say that? I think I said that. No, it was 1575 when they did the partial restoration, so that's 100 years later. So that's 100 years later. There was this Egyptian pharaoh called Ptolemy III, and he was a very proactive sort of pharaoh, sort of leader, and he actually took over that partially restored city, which is city 4, which is the last version that's ever existed of Jericho. So he took it over and started using it. Previously, it was so remote, it was very easterly within the Egyptian empire. It was more or less left to its own devices. And in fact, it continued to really be like a Hyksos city. Same practices. They found the same sort of crockery and other utensils in the city as they did in the earlier version of the city when the Hyksos had occupied it. And moving later, there arises another leader here, another pharaoh, Amenhotep, we probably pronounced it wrong, Amenhotep III. And as we said, life in Jericho continued very much as it had done, but during his reign, which ended very abruptly, during his reign, the Jordan was dammed at a place called Edi Dami, and then the city was destroyed by Joshua, as we read in chapter 6. I wonder whether that name, Idi Dami, rings a bell, because the place where the Jordan was dammed was called Adam, wasn't it? And that's the same place, I think. That's where the Jordan was dammed north of the crossing point, so that the river was temporarily diverted, and that happened here. I'll mention some more of those interesting events later on. Now, the next king was Akhenaten, and Akhenaten was responsible for some letters. They call them Amarna letters, and the Amarna letters are actually a sort of chronicle of the prominent cities in the Egyptian Empire, and no reference is made to Jericho. The dating of these was about 1385 or 1375, 10 years later. Now that's interesting, because that means that the city didn't exist really, it had been effectively destroyed. So it sets a latest date for the destruction of Jericho, and Garstan considered that the most probable date was BC 1385. Now there has been subsequent archaeological work. Kathleen Kenyon did some work and came up with a different date. But Garstan goes to great lengths to show why he considers this date to be correct, and it actually does line up very well with Scripture. So I quite like his date. So that's probably enough about the history and the prominent men at the time, Egyptian men. We don't know actually the name of the Pharaoh who was in charge when the children of Israel were expelled during the time of Moses, but it's quite possible that it was this Amenhotep III. And I believe there's no record of him after this 1385 date, BC 1385. Okay, so let's have a look now what actually happened. Let's turn to our Bibles. First of all, look at the previous chapter, the one we read, Joshua 5, because that's where it seems to start. So Joshua 5 and verse 13. So it came to pass that when Joshua was by Jericho, that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there stood a man over against him, with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went unto him, said unto him, Art thou for us, or against us, or for our adversaries? And he said, Nay, but as the captain of the host of the Lord am I now come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth, and did worship, and said unto him, What saith my Lord unto his servant? And the captain of the Lord's host said unto Joshua, Loose thy shoe from off thy foot. Place whereon thou standest is holy. And Joshua did so. So here was this meeting between Joshua and an angel of the Lord, who said he was the captain of Yahweh's host. Now we move into the next chapter. We see that, the first verse, that Jericho was straightly shut up because of the children of Israel. None went out and none came in, so they were fearful. We know they were fearful. Rahab had confessed the fear that the inhabitants of Jericho had for the children of Israel, because they'd heard what they'd done on the other side of Jordan, of course. Reading into verse 2, and the Lord, now, Yahweh, now this is the same man, this is the same as the man who spoke to Joshua in verse 13 of the previous chapter. The Lord said unto Joshua, See, I have given unto thine hand Jericho, and the king thereof, and the mighty men of valour. And ye shall compass the city, all ye men of war, go round about the city once, and thou shalt do it 6 days. 7 priests shall bear before the ark 7 trumpets, ram's horns, and the 7th day ye shall compass the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow with the trumpets. It shall come to pass that when they make a long blast with the ram's horns, when ye hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, the wall of the city shall fall down flat, and the people shall ascend up every man straight before him. So there were the instructions given by this angel of God, this Yahweh, God speaking to Joshua. So this was the sort of procession that was to go around the city. First there was to be armed men, then there were the priests with the trumpet, and then the priests with the ark, and then armed men behind. So that was the procession that was to go around the city. It would have been terrifying, wouldn't it, to occupiers of Jericho to look out and see what are they doing, because they're not making a sound. That was an important instruction to the Israelites. See, in verse 10 it says, Joshua had commanded the people, saying, Ye shall not shout, nor make any noise with your voice, neither shall any word proceed out of your mouth, until the day I bid you shout, then ye shall shout. So there was this huge contrast in their behaviour. It was to be quiet. There was the sounding of the trumpets, but there was to be no voice heard. And that's really very interesting. We shall come back to that right at the end of what we have to say. There's a picture of the sort of horns they probably use. They're shofars, they're ram's horns. I've got a fairly small one here, which is a real one. It's a real shofar, this. And if I didn't think I would make a complete fool of myself, I'd try and blow it for you. But it's quite hard. But when it's done properly, you get quite a loud noise out of this. And anyone afterwards who would like to have a go is welcome to try. So that's it. This would have been a smaller version of the horns that they were probably using as they surrounded the city of Jericho. Now they did exactly what they'd been commanded to do, which is also significant. They did what they were told, and it was very effective. It might have seemed stupid to them, mightn't it? What are we doing this for? Why don't we just try and invade? But they did what they were commanded to do. We'll just comment on that in just a second. And so in the 17th verse of this chapter, the city, it says, shall be accursed or devoted, even it and all that are therein, to Yahweh, to the Lord. Only Rahab the harlot shall live, she and all that are with her in the house, because she hid the messengers that we sent. And ye in any wise keep yourselves from the accursed thing, the things that are devoted to God, the things that are rightfully God's, lest you make yourselves accursed when you take of the accursed thing and make the camp of Israel accursed and trouble it. We know, of course, that someone didn't obey that instruction, Achan, the troubler of Israel, because he did take of some of the spoil and hid it for himself. It was devoted to Yahweh. It was Yahweh's, and the whole action was Yahweh's, wasn't it? It was a totally impractical way for any army to take a city. But this was Yahweh's operation completely. So verse 19, all the silver and the gold and the vessels of brass and iron are consecrated unto the Lord. They shall come unto the treasury of the Lord. So, we read what they actually did in verse 20. The people shouted when the priests blew with the trumpet. And it came to pass when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, and the people shouted with a great shout, the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. And they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old, ox and sheep, ass, with the edge of the sword. It was a total taking of the city. In fact, as we see later, it was actually burned. Now, we just emphasised earlier, didn't we, that they weren't following any sort of human strategy. This was totally unhuman, wasn't it? An extraordinary thing to do, and would have been rather terrifying, I think, to the occupiers of Jericho to see this procession 6 days around the city, no sound being made. And we read, don't we, in Hebrews, perhaps I'll just read it, but in Hebrews chapter 11, that this was, in verse 30 we read there, that by faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encompassed about 7 days. It was by faith, it was belief. Because those who did it were doing what they were told by Yahweh, by God. And that's why it worked. And it was the case also with Rahab. By faith, the harlot Rahab perished not with them that believed not, when she had received the spies with peace. It was faith in her case, belief, conviction that the God of Israel was in the situation, and the God of Israel would control the events. And that's exactly what happened, isn't it? Well, just continuing our reading of this 6th chapter, picking out some special verses, verse 22. We're not going to say very much about Rahab. Obviously, it's a subject in itself, a very interesting subject, which we've also dealt with in the past in our Bible classes. But Joshua said unto the 2 men that had spied out the country, Go into the harlot's house, and bring out thence the woman and all that she hath, as ye swear unto her. There had been a promise made. And so in verse 25, Joshua saved Rahab, the harlot, alive, and her father's household, all that she had. She dwelt in Israel even to this day, because she hid the messengers which Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. A woman of faith, and, as we know, also a progenitor of the Lord Jesus Christ. It was faith that did it. So it was faith that saved Rahab, and it was faith that destroyed Jericho. It was belief in the God of Israel, in Yahweh. Verse 24, which you just missed out. They burned the city with fire, and all that was there, only the silver and the gold, the vessels and the brass and iron, they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. Those were the things that were devoted to God. But everything else was burnt. It was a complete destruction. I'll tell you a little story now. It concerns this rugby connection that we have. And some of you will know Alan Overton, or knew, he's now dead of course. But he was very, very friendly with one of the Garstangs, probably both of them, because there was this rugby connection anyway. And he tells this story, or he used to tell the story, about one of the Garstangs coming down. I'm not sure whether it was the son or the father. And he came back from one of his expeditions in Jericho, in the Holy Land, and he told his brother to put out your hand. Put out his hand. And this John Garstang took his hand and dropped into his hand some burnt seeds, grain. He says, they're from the city of Jericho. And they're evidence that the whole city was burned. And there's some pictures here of that, the grain that was found in the city of Jericho, evidence that, just as scriptures tell us here, it was actually burnt. The whole place was burnt. That's just an enlarged view. That's just an enlarged view taken out of there. Sorry, they're all black and white, these pictures, but they're taken from the book that he wrote on the 2 Garstangs wrote on the history of Jericho. And I think they're just valuable pictures, even though they're only black and white. So, how could this have happened? What's likely to have caused such an extraordinary event as the sudden collapse of these walls? We mentioned they weren't particularly well built, but they were still walls, and it's considerable weight of stone there. And this is a cross section, which again it's a feature of the book that John Garstang, his son, wrote. Which a cross-section through the 2 walls of Jericho, which was obviously after it had been destroyed, because this was what it looked like in about 1924, that sort of time. You can see here, that's actually there is part of the 2nd Jericho, so it's a pretty substantial wall. That's an inner wall. And then this is the remains of the outer wall, which you see has actually fallen away over that way, with this sort of rubble in between, this debris in between. That's the level, that's the floor level there of the city of Jericho in BC 1600. So you can see, and all this lot is debris which had to be removed before they could actually see the state of the walls. And there's debris here as well, and also white ash there, evidence again of very high temperatures. Very interesting picture that, and the Garstangs consider that the only feasible cause of such a collapse was that there was an earthquake which caused it to collapse in that way. In fact, there's some pictures there of the state of the walls. I think it's very difficult to make these out, these pictures. But there are pictures of that outer wall as it had fallen away, as it had collapsed. Now, I think it probably was an earthquake, almost certainly was an earthquake. Now that, just to emphasise, that this doesn't in any way reduce the miraculous nature of what happened. God tends to use natural phenomena in order to achieve his stated purpose. So it's no less miraculous that it was an earthquake, and earthquakes happen in other parts of the world as well. The miracle was that it happened exactly when the children of Israel shouted. No one imagines that the shout from the Israelite walking around the city was going to make the walls fall down. It was something else. It was the hand of God. And in all probability, God produced this earthquake. Now there's a book written by Tony Benson, I think you may have known it, called Stormy Wind Fulfilling His Word, which is a quotation from the scripture, but the whole book is devoted to showing how God uses natural phenomena in order to achieve his objectives. And there's a table here, as we say, it's earthquakes in the Bible, and he details various earthquakes that you can see in the earlier history, and he comes on to the walls of Jericho. So clearly Tony Benson thought that the fall of Jericho, the way the walls fell down, was in fact due to an earthquake. There's another table, an interesting table in the Garstang book, which actually also lists a number of earthquakes which are known about in the history of the area. One in the Stone Age, one about 2000 BC, which destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, which is interesting. One about 1450 BC, an earthquake at Jericho. Now that's before the earthquake that would have destroyed the fourth city that we're considering. There is evidence in the remains of the fourth city that there was an earthquake earlier. There are cracks, and they're all illustrated in the book. So it's very interesting. That wasn't the first time there'd been an earthquake in the city of Jericho. He considered that this was an earthquake that caused the city, so he isn't listed there. But he goes on to speak about other earthquakes that have been known in the area, right down until 1927. That's an interesting one, actually, because that's around about the time that the Garstangs were doing their excavations. And this is another story, another Brother Overton story. Coming back from one of the expeditions, he said that there were two of them. I don't know whether it was two Garstangs, whether it's Garstang and someone else, but there were two of them sitting on the bank of the Jordan, over on the eastern side, level with Jericho, and they were looking across the river to the hills on the opposite side, and they were talking about where the Israelites might have crossed the Jordan. And they looked down into the river, and there was a rock sticking up in the middle of the river. And they carried on talking, and then one said, "Just a minute, is that rock getting bigger?" And they looked a bit longer, and sure enough, this rock was emerging from the water. This is factual. It's not. This is 1927. It was this earthquake that caused a land blockage. It produced a damming of the River Jordan for 21 hours. Jordan was dry in this area. 1927. So again, the fact that it's a natural event doesn't reduce the miraculous character of it. Children of Israel crossed the Jordan, and they were there. They needed something to allow them to cross the Jordan, and God produced an earthquake, which produced a damming effect of the river, and so his word was fulfilled. So I think it's just interesting that the way God uses natural events to bring to pass his purpose, no less miraculous. It's really the timing that's miraculous. The event itself is a natural event, but the timing of it is quite miraculous. Now there is a reference in this 6th chapter of Joshua to rebuilding Jericho. In fact, what it says is in verse 26 of this chapter, it's probably in front of us, Joshua adjured them at that time, saying, Cursed be the man before the Lord that riseth up and buildeth this city Jericho. He shall lay the foundation thereof in his firstborn, and in his youngest son shall he set up the gates of it. Well, someone did try and do it, and there's a record of it. It's in the King's record. I'll show you. It's in 1 Kings 16. We probably know this quite well, but let's turn to it. 1 Kings chapter 16, right at the end of the chapter, verse 34. Oh, I don't know why I said verse 4. It's verse 34. In his days did Hiel the Bethelite build Jericho. He laid the foundation thereof in Abiram his firstborn. In other words, Abiram his firstborn died, so he lost his firstborn. And he set up the gates thereof in his youngest son Segub, so he lost his youngest son as well, according to the word of the Lord which he spake by Joshua the son of Nun. And those words we just read from that 26th verse of Joshua chapter 6. So there was an attempt to rebuild Jericho, but it was a cursed attempt. Now there are other references later to the city of palm trees, as it was called. It is to Jericho. Interestingly enough, it was Eglon. Remember Eglon, the great big fat Moabite, and Ehud's sword. Remember, it got stuck, didn't it? But it was in. It looked as though it was in Jericho, or the city of palm trees, where this event happened. So this is in Judges 3. Perhaps we'll quickly get Judges chapter 3 and verse 13. They gathered unto him the children of Ammon and Amalek, and went and smote Israel, and possessed the city of palm trees. They possessed the city. Didn't build it. Wasn't much of it really, but they probably did a little bit of work in it. They presumably made a summer house, because that's where he was, wasn't it, when he was killed. It's referred to as the city of palm trees in 2 Chronicles 28, which you don't need to turn to just now. That's just another name for Jericho. Okay, so that's the way the city was, the way it was positioned, the important people around it, how it was destroyed, how there was an attempt made to rebuild it, but it was a cursed attempt, as Joshua had predicted, under the hand of God, and how it was just occupied temporarily by the Moabites, by Eglon. Let's have a look, just to conclude, with the typical significance of the fall of Jericho. It is an extraordinary business, isn't it? This 7 times around the city, and then on the 7th day, 7 times, and then comes the destruction when they shout. Reminds us very much, doesn't it, of the sevenfold judgments on Rome. These are the 7 seals spoken of in the book of Revelation. As we know, the 7th seal was divided into 7 trumpets. Here's the ram's horns again. The first 4 of these were wind trumpets, and they were mostly judgments on the western parts of the Roman Empire. And the last 3 are woe trumpets. The first 2 woe trumpets were judgments on the eastern side of the Roman Empire. But the last trumpet, the woe trumpet, was divided into another 7 vials, or containers. And these vials were poured out, and an account of what happened when they were poured out is given in the book of Revelation. Now, we believe that we're probably living here, in this period here, of the 6th vial, when the great river Euphrates, that is the Turkish power, was dried up, which has been done, roughly in our areas, probably completely dried up in 1917, when Allenby drove the Turks out of Palestine. And we're still waiting for this 7th vial. The 7th vial, here it is, like the 7th sounding of the 7th trumpet. So it's remarkably similar, isn't it, to the procession around Jericho 7 times, and then the last day 7 times again, and then a great shout and a great earthquake. In fact, it's interesting, I haven't got this on the screen, but it's in Revelation chapter 16, where this is mentioned. We read here, verse 18, remember the seventh vial is divided. Once the seventh vial is poured out, it's divided into seven thunders. And there's verse 18 of chapter 16 of Revelation. And there were voices and thunders and lightnings. There was a great earthquake, such as was not since men were upon the earth. So mighty an earthquake, and so great. And the great city, now he's talking about Rome now, the great city was divided into three parts. The cities of the nations fell, and great Babylon, which is Babylon the Great, Rome, came in remembrance before God to give unto her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. And so Rome was destroyed. Babylon the Great, and there's a great lamentation over the fall. But it's, again, similarity. There was an earthquake that did it, and it was upon the seventh sounding of the seventh trumpet that this happened. So there's a depiction of the results of this earthquake, which results in the fall of Babylon. Babylon is fallen. It's burned with fire, just as Jericho was burned with fire. In this case, all the official illuminati of the city were all brought to nothing. The cardinals, bishops, deacons, vicars, and so on, and including the Pope. So the papacy is removed, and so Babylon falls. Rather in the way that that fall had occurred so many years before of the city of Jericho, a city that lay very low. It lay very low, as it were, in the moral estimate of things. Now, we're pretty well finished. I finished sooner than I expected. But we want to just conclude by thinking about the significance of the way they did this, the way they went round the city, sounding these trumpets, but not speaking, not saying anything. And it reminds us of a passage in Isaiah chapter 42. That there's a time for everything. There is a time for everything under the sun. That's what it says in Ecclesiastes 3, isn't it? The preacher says there is a time for everything. There's a time to speak and a time to be silent. And this was a time to be silent. And if we look at the first two verses of this chapter, it's prophetic of Jesus. Behold, my servant whom I uphold, mine elect in whom my soul delighteth. I have put my spirit upon him. He shall bring forth judgment to the Gentiles. He shall not cry, nor lift up, nor cause his voice to be heard in the street. So he was to be quiet. And that was the characteristic of Jesus during the time of trial. But it's not going to always be like that, because if we look a bit later on in the chapter, 13th verse, the Lord shall go forth as a mighty man. He shall stir up jealousy like a man of war. He shall cry, yea, roar. He shall prevail against his enemies. Long time have I holden my peace. I have been still and refrained myself, says God. Now will I cry like a travailing woman. I will destroy and devour at once. And that was what happened with the children of Israel, who silently went round this city which was destined to be destroyed, making no sound at all. Trumpets were sounding, things were happening, things were developing, but there was no sound of a voice until the signal was given that they should shout, and then they did indeed shout, just as the Lord Jesus Christ will when he returns. So there are these two periods, aren't there? There's a period of quietness, of submission, and we're in that period, really. We can't really assert our rights. We have to be quiet, we have to submit. But there will come a time when we will shout and prevail against God's enemies, the enemies of his people, Israel. is that we have to observe the instruction, just as the children of Israel were faithful, because the walls fell by faith, because they believed in what God said. So we need to believe what God says. We need to believe God when he says that the system of things which controls the earth that we live in now isn't there forever. The various types of government that rule the earth at the moment, which seem, although very immoral, nonetheless seem unmovable, they're not really unmovable, any more than Jericho was unmovable. The time will come when they will fall. But we just have to do as we're told, just like the children of Israel did. We have to abide in stillness, observing that things are working out, trumpets are sounding, things are happening. But we need to hold our peace until that time comes when we shall shout. So just finally, we're waiting for the return, aren't we, of the latter day Joshua. Jesus' name and Joshua's name are the same, aren't they? Jehoshua, Yah will save. And we want to accompany him. We want to be with him when, in the future, he enters the promised land to remove the enemies of God's people and to inherit the promises that have been made to Abraham and to his seed.